The courtroom was silent as everyone awaited the arrival of the defendant. A figure walked in, his leather jacket creaking as he shuffled toward the front, where the judge sat in his powerful chair, ruling over the room with a sharp, cold stare. His tattoos, large and bold, stretched across his arms and neck, boasting his affiliation with a notorious gang that had terrorized the streets. His defiance was palpable, and it was clear he thought his tough exterior would be enough to intimidate those in the room. But little did he know, Judge Boyd was a force to be reckoned with. Judge Boyd, a veteran of the courtroom, had seen it all: the brash, the proud, and the utterly disrespectful. He wasn't the type to be swayed by appearances or street talk. As the defendant's heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor, Judge Boyd remained unmoved, his eyes fixed firmly on the man before him. This wasn't a game, and this court wouldn't tolerate any disrespect. The defendant's challenge. The young gangster punk swaggered into the courtroom, his head held high as he eyed the room with an air of superiority. His tattoos were his armor, and he believed they gave him strength. Each tattoo was a symbol, a mark of his rebellion and defiance against authority. He wasn't worried. He had made it through worse situations, and he was confident he could play the system just like he had done with everything else in his life. The courtroom was just another stage for him to dominate. As the prosecutor began to lay out the charges, the punk sat back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. He let out a low snicker, casting a sideways glance at his lawyer. His body language screamed arrogance. He was unfazed by the weight of the accusations, convinced that his defiant attitude would be enough to push through. The judge had made no motion to stop him or even call for order, but this was exactly what the gangster punk didn't understand. Judge Boyd wasn't going to let him disrupt the court with his childish games. The moment the defendant opened his mouth to interrupt the prosecutor's opening statement, Judge Boyd's voice cut through the room like a hot knife through butter. "Mr. Lawson, I suggest you save the jokes for another place. This is a courtroom, not a playground." The punk's smirk faltered for a moment. He wasn't used to being called out, especially not so bluntly. But he recovered quickly, his defiance back in full force as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He had no intention of letting the judge intimidate him. Mockery of the court, the defendant continued his attempt to undermine the seriousness of the proceedings. When the witnesses began to testify, he rolled his eyes, clearly trying to show his lack of respect for the process. Each time the prosecutor spoke, the gangster punk would chuckle, making sarcastic remarks under his breath, as though the courtroom was his personal stage to entertain himself. At one point, he even mimicked the prosecutor's voice, mocking their words in an exaggerated tone, trying to elicit laughter from his defense team. The court was visibly uncomfortable, but Judge Boyd remained calm, watching with a quiet intensity. He knew this behavior wasn't just an attempt to disrupt the court, it was an attack on the very institution of justice. As the prosecutor continued with the presentation, the gangster punk grew bolder, interrupting witnesses with snide comments and laughs, each one louder than the last. His behavior had escalated from mere disrespect to full-blown mockery, yet Judge Boyd didn't flinch. The turning point, after the fourth outburst, Judge Boyd had had enough. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the clicking of a pen. He raised his hand, signaling for the courtroom to be quiet, his voice now steady and controlled, carrying the weight of years of experience in the legal system. "Mr. Lawson, you've had your fun, but you've forgotten one very important thing. This is not your world." "You don't make the rules here," Judge Boyd said, his gaze unwavering. "If you wish to continue this performance, I'll have you removed from this courtroom immediately." The gangster punk's defiance faltered for the first time. There was no smirk, no cocky comment, just a brief hesitation. He wasn't used to being called out like this, not by anyone, let alone a judge. "You may think you can play games with the law, but let me remind you," Judge Boyd continued, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't a game. This is a place where lives are changed, where consequences are real. You're not here for entertainment. You're here because you've broken the law, and now you will face the consequences." For a brief moment, the room fell into complete silence. The gangster punk, who had been making a spectacle of the trial, suddenly seemed to realize that Judge Boyd wasn't like the others. The defiant sneer that had been present on his face was now replaced with a hint of unease. The judge's command. Judge Boyd turned to the rest of the room, making it clear that his courtroom would not be taken lightly. He wasn't going to let one person's behavior overshadow the proceedings, especially not someone who had no respect for the law. Mr. Lawson, I'm giving you one last opportunity to sit in silence and respect this court, or you will face the consequences. You will not be allowed to turn this court into a circus, and you will not mock the process. Understand? The gangster punk nodded reluctantly, though his pride remained intact. His attitude had shifted from defiance to caution, knowing he had to at least feign respect for the court if he wanted to avoid further trouble. But the damage had already been done. Judge Boyd had made it clear that no one, no matter who they were, would be allowed to disrespect the legal process in his courtroom. The shift in the room, the rest of the trial proceeded with a tense air. The gangster punk's behavior had dramatically shifted. He no longer mocked the witnesses, and his sarcasm was replaced with a more calculated silence. The trial continued, but the air was thick with the realization that the courtroom was not a place for games. As Judge Boyd moved through the case, issuing his commands with a firm yet controlled manner, the punk seemed to shrink into his seat, his previous cocky attitude nowhere to be found. He was now facing the reality of what it meant to be in a courtroom that demanded respect and accountability. The defiant gangster punk had finally realized the truth. No one was above the law, not even him. And in Judge Boyd's courtroom, the law would always come first. The gangster punk sat there, his earlier bravado now replaced by an uncomfortable silence. He wasn't used to being silenced, to feeling like the power in the room had shifted away from him. For the first time in his life, he realized that his tattoos, his reputation on the streets, and his tough exterior meant nothing in this space. Judge Boyd had set the tone, and now the courtroom followed his lead. The punk's earlier mocking had been met with calm authority, and it had stopped him in his tracks. As the trial continued, the punk's body language shifted. His posture had gone from cocky and defiant to hunched and subdued. His arms, once folded across his chest in defiance, were now limp at his sides. His eyes, which had once scanned the room with a challenge in every glance, now stared down at the table in front of him. Judge Boyd had effectively turned the tables, and the punk was no longer in control of the situation. He had come in with one goal, to show that he could disrupt the court, play the system, and walk away unscathed. But Judge Boyd had shown him something far more important, that the law wasn't a game to be played with, and this court would not let anyone tarnish its integrity. The judge's unwavering authority. As the proceedings moved forward, Judge Boyd showed no sign of backing down. He was unshaken by the punk's earlier antics, and it was clear that the court was now operating on his terms. The gangster punk's lawyer tried to interject at one point, attempting to discredit the witness, but Judge Boyd's gaze shot over to him with a chilling precision. "Mr. Lawrence, your objections are noted," Judge Boyd said, his voice calm yet firm. "But they will not derail the process. This court will not be swayed by games or distractions." The defense lawyer quickly fell silent, realizing that the judge wasn't interested in wasting time on tactics that had no place in the courtroom. Judge Boyd's authority was absolute, and no one was going to challenge that. Not today, not ever. The turning point. As the case progressed, the gangster punk was faced with the harsh reality of his actions. For the first time, he began to feel the weight of the law. The laughter and sarcasm had disappeared. He was no longer the untouchable street tough. Instead, he was a defendant facing a judge who had no interest in his reputation or his history. This wasn't about street credibility, this was about justice. The courtroom atmosphere, once tense and filled with the punk's attempts to deflect attention from his actions, had become somber and serious. Judge Boyd's unyielding control over the room had forced the defendant to realize that the law didn't bend for anyone. His tattoos didn't matter, his attitude didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was the law, and how it would deal with him, the moment of consequences. As the time came for Judge Boyd to deliver the final verdict, the room was thick with anticipation. The gangster punk, who had been so full of bravado at the start, was now a shadow of his former self. His arrogance had dissolved into the cold reality of what was happening. He had crossed a line, the law had caught up with him. Judge Boyd took a moment, looking down at the paperwork before him. The room was still, no one moved. Then, in a voice that echoed through the courtroom, he began, "Mr. Lawson, you've wasted the court's time with games, disrespect, and mockery. But let me be clear, you will face the consequences of your actions. Your tattoos, your street cred, your cocky attitude, they mean nothing here. The law stands above everything." The gangster punk could only stare at the judge, his eyes wide, a mix of defiance and fear flashing in his gaze. Judge Boyd's words hit harder than any physical blow. The punk knew what was coming. "You are hereby sentenced to the full extent of the law. You will be held accountable for the crimes you've committed, and you will serve your time." Judge Boyd continued, his voice unyielding. "The law does not bend for anyone, and it certainly does not play games with anyone." The final decision, as the sentence was handed down, the punk's body slumped, his head hanging low. He was no longer the confident man who had walked into the courtroom that morning. He was a defendant who had lost, who had underestimated the power of the law. And as the bailiffs moved to take him away, there was no grand final show of bravado, only the silent walk to his fate. Judge Boyd's stern gaze followed the defendant as he was led out of the courtroom. He had proven a point one that no one in that room would forget. The law, when administered by a judge with unshakable integrity and authority, was more powerful than any gang affiliation, tattoo, or street reputation. As the door closed behind the defendant, the room returned to its normal rhythm. Judge Boyd's eyes remained focused on the paperwork in front of him. The courtroom was calm once again, and the judge had done what he did best, upheld the law. The punk may have walked in thinking he could play games with the court, but Judge Boyd had made sure that didn't happen. His authority had spoken louder than any tattooed gangster's defiance, and in the end, it was justice that had triumphed. As the courtroom cleared, the message was clear to everyone present. In Judge Boyd's court, there would be no room for games, only the unwavering force of the law.